Every family has a story they buried deeper than the ones they died with. This is one of those stories. Passed down through 4 generations, whispered at funerals, never written down until now. It begins in 1854 on a plantation called Hollow Creek, with a man who believed nothing in this world could touch him. He was wrong. Before we continue, if stories like this keep you up at night, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We drop a new one every week. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Augustine Reyes was, by every account that survives him, a proud and merciless man. He had inherited Hollow Creek from his father, who had inherited it from his father before that. 3 generations of a family that measured its worth in acres and silence. He married Camille when she was 19, the daughter of a shipping merchant, chosen not for love, but for the alliance her family's money would bring. Camille was quiet, watchful, and far sharper than her husband ever gave her credit for. In the 2 years of their marriage, she had learned exactly one thing about Augustine. He could not stand to be doubted. So when she began to suspect something was wrong, not with the crops, not with the accounts, but with him, she said nothing at first. She only watched. He would disappear for hours in the evening, returning long after dark with an expression she couldn't read. He grew short-tempered with the household staff in a way that felt less like cruelty and more like fear. And once, only once, she heard him arguing with someone in the old stone smokehouse at the edge of property, a building that had stood empty, by every account she'd been given, for over a decade. When she asked him about it, he laughed. "You're imagining things, Camille. A woman alone in a big house too often starts inventing company." She let it go for a while when Camille discovered she was pregnant. The entire plantation seemed to hold its breath in relief. An heir meant stability. It meant the Reyes name would continue. And for the first time since their wedding, Augustine looked at his wife with something close to warmth. But Camille noticed something else in that same look. Underneath the warmth, something closer to calculation, as though the child growing inside her wasn't just a son or daughter to him, but a piece being moved into place on a board only he could see. She tried to dismiss it as pregnancy nerves. She tried, and largely succeeded, for 7 months. Then, one evening in her 3rd trimester, unable to sleep, she rose to fetch water and passed by the study window. Augustine was outside in the moonlight, standing perfectly still at the edge of the tree line, facing the old smokehouse. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He was simply standing there, watching the building the way a man watches something he's waiting for permission to approach. She never asked him about it, but from that night on, she began keeping a small notebook hidden beneath a floorboard beneath her side of the bed, recording everything she saw and everything that didn't add up. She would need it later. She just didn't know it yet. The child was born on a stormy night in April. A boy, healthy, loud, with a full head of dark hair. The midwife placed him in Camille's arms, and for a moment, exhausted and relieved, she simply held him and cried the way new mothers do. Then she looked into his eyes. They were not Augustine's eyes. Augustine's eyes were a flat, unremarkable brown, the color of dry riverbed clay. The child's eyes were a pale, striking gray, almost silver in the candlelight, with a depth to them that made the midwife pause mid-sentence and quietly step back from the bed. Camille didn't understand the significance of that color at first. Not until Augustine walked into the room, took one look at his newborn son, and went completely, dangerously still. "Whose child is this?" he said. Not a question. A verdict already being written. "He's ours," Camille said, though her voice shook more than she wanted it to. "He's your son, Augustine." He didn't raise his voice. That was, in its way, more frightening than if he had. He simply stared at the child's gray eyes for a long moment, turned, and walked out of the room without another word. He didn't return for 3 days. When Augustine finally spoke to Camille again, it wasn't with anger. It was with the cold, methodical tone of a man building a case. He'd spoken to the overseer. He'd spoken to 2 of the household staff. He had, in his mind, already assembled a story that satisfied him. And in that story, Camille was not the wrong party. She was the accused. He named a man, a stable hand named Josiah, who had gray eyes and had worked at Hollow Creek for 6 years. Camille barely knew the man beyond passing in the yard. But Augustine had already decided, and once Augustine decided something, reality was expected to rearrange itself around his conclusion. "You will confess," he told her, "or I will make an example that this entire county remembers." Camille, for the first time in their marriage, did not stay quiet. "I have kept a record, Augustine," she said, "of every night you disappeared, every hour you stood outside that smokehouse, every conversation you had with someone who was never supposed to be there. If you want to speak of secrets, I have a book full of yours." For the first time since she'd known him, Augustine Reyes looked afraid. Camille never told anyone. Not her sister, not the midwife, not even the notebook. What she saw the night she finally worked up the courage to follow Augustine to the smokehouse herself. She waited until he left the house near midnight, as he always did, and she followed at a distance, her infant son sleeping in a basket she'd hidden in the nursery under the care of a trusted servant. She watched her husband unlock the smokehouse door, a door that, by every official record, hadn't been used in over a decade, and slip inside. She crept close enough to look through a gap in the boarded window. Inside, by lantern light, sat an old woman Camille had never seen before in her life. Skin like weathered leather, eyes clouded white with age or blindness, sitting in a chair that looked far too fine for a smokehouse, an heirloom, perhaps, or a relic taken from somewhere else entirely. Augustine knelt before her like a penitent in church. "The child has her eyes," Camille heard him say, voice cracking a way she'd never heard from before. "Just like you warned me, the debt is coming due." The old woman's clouded eyes seemed impossibly to turn directly toward the window where Camille was hiding. "The debt was never to delay," the old woman said, her voice like dry paper. "It belongs to bloodline, and bloodlines do not forget what they are owed." Camille fled before she heard anything more. She didn't sleep again that night, or for many nights after. What Camille eventually pieced together, from fragments, from servants too frightened to say much, from her own notebook filled with dates and half-truths, was this: Augustine's grandfather, the first Reyes to own Hollow Creek, had made an arrangement decades earlier with a woman the old plantation records only ever referred to as the healer. In exchange for prosperity, good harvest, healthy livestock, a plantation that thrived while others around it failed year after year, the Reyes family owed something back. Not money, something older and stranger than money. Every third generation, a child would be born who did not entirely belong to the father, a child with a healer's eyes, marking them as the one who would carry the arrangement forward. It had happened to Augustine's grandfather's generation. It had skipped his father's. And now, 60 years later, it had come again to Augustine's own son. Augustine hadn't been unfaithful in accusing Camille out of jealousy. He'd been terrified of a debt he'd hoped, prayed, would pass him by the way it had passed his father. And when it hadn't, he'd looked for anyone else to blame rather than face what it truly meant. Camille confronted him with everything. The notebook, what she'd seen through the smokehouse window, every fragment she'd gathered. She expected fury. What she got instead was a broken man finally telling the truth. "I thought if I gave him a normal name," Augustine said, sitting in the dark study, refusing to look at her, "if I raised him as mine and never spoke of it, the arrangement would simply forget him. I was a fool to think you could hide a debt from something that keeps such careful count. What happens to him?" Camille demanded. "What happens to our son?" Augustine finally looked up, and for the first time, she saw not cruelty in his face, but genuine, hollowed-out grief. "The healer doesn't take the child," he said quietly. "She takes something from him instead. A piece of his fortune, his health, sometimes his voice, sometimes his sight, always something that marks him as hers for the rest of his life. So the family never forgets what it owes." "Then we stop it," Camille said. "Tonight." What Camille did next was never recorded in any official plantation ledger, but it survived in family memory, passed mother to daughter for generations after. She went to the smokehouse alone, her infant son wrapped against her chest, and she knelt before the old woman the way Augustine had knelt weeks before. "You will not take anything from my son," Camille said. "Not his sight, not his voice, not one piece of him." The old woman's clouded eyes studied her for a long, silent moment. "The debt must be paid by someone," she finally said. "That has always been the arrangement." "Then let it be paid by me," Camille said. "Not him. Me." There was a long silence in that smokehouse, long enough that Camille later said she aged years standing in it. Then the old woman smiled, slow and knowing, as though she had been waiting for exactly this offer since the day the arrangement was first made, decades before Camille was even born. "Very well," she said. "A mother's offering weighs heavier than a father's fear ever could." Camille walked out of that smokehouse before dawn, her son still sleeping peacefully against her chest, seemingly unharmed. For weeks, nothing seemed to change, and she allowed herself to believe cautiously that the price had somehow been small, a debt quietly settled and forgotten. She was wrong. It came slowly, over the following year, small lapses in memory at first. Forgetting a name she'd known her whole life, forgetting the words of a lullaby she'd sung to her son every night since his birth. Then larger gaps, days she couldn't account for, faces of people she loved that would occasionally, terrifyingly, look like strangers to her. By the time her son turned 5, Camille could no longer remember she had a husband at all, though Augustine never left her side again for the rest of his life. Sitting with her through every lost hour, every blank stare, the way a man sits beside a debt he can never fully repay. Her son grew up healthy, whole, untouched by whatever arrangement had shaped 3 generations before him. He never knew, until he was much older, exactly what his mother had traded for that. The smokehouse at Hollow Creek was torn down in 1891, long after Augustine's death, by a grandson who'd heard only fragments of the story and wanted no part of whatever memory the building held. But those who worked the land afterward swore that on certain still nights, near the old foundation stones that were never fully removed, you could hear a woman quietly singing a lullaby to a child who was no longer there. The Reyes family line continued for generations after, prosperous, respected, and, as far as any record shows, never again visited by a child with eyes that didn't belong to its father. Whether that was luck, or whether it was simply the price of one mother's bargain finally, fully paid, no one left alive can say for certain. If this story gave you chills, don't scroll away just yet. Subscribe now so you don't miss next week's story. It might just be the one that keeps you up all night. This story was passed down through a family that still, to this day, refuses to speak the name Hollow Creek above a whisper. Whether every detail is true, embellished by generations of retelling, or something else entirely, is impossible to know. But if you ever find an old, boarded-up building on land that's been in a family for generations, one nobody quite remembers the purpose of, I'd think twice before asking what debts it was built to keep.